Specialty care at peripheral centers for a general ophthalmologist during COVID and when to refer is IC number 72, and Dr. Lakshmi C is the chief instructor.
Good afternoon to you all. I know that it's the last day and one of the last sessions post lunch, and it's natural to feel sleepy, but we bid adieu to the hardcore theory and we step upon certain practical sessions. So we introduce our keynote speaker. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor C.V. Radha Devi, our keynote speaker, who is a retired professor of ophthalmology and head of the department, Government Medical College Thrissur and Amala Medical College, and she has served as the superintendent and director of Regional Institute of Ophthalmology Trivandrum, and has served in most of the medical colleges in Kerala. And above all, she is a passionate surgeon, a multi-talented individual, and an affectionate teacher. So her career spans through the ages where the cataract surgery was done through ab-externo incision to phacoemulsification, and she has taken the effort to keep abreast with all the procedures and go for regular trainings. So over to you, Professor C.V. Radha Devi, to deliver the keynote address on an era when there was no specialty and the lessons that we should not forget.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, let me thank KSO's Drishti 2020 organizing team for giving me this platform. I would also like to thank Dr. Lakshmi, Chief Instructor of this course, for giving me this opportunity. We'll go to the slides. In my talk, I would like to rewind, that is to take you back in time a bit, and we can recollect the important messages that we should not forget when we move forward. I will also be talking about some aspects of comprehensive eye care. So let's start from the beginning. This is a history of eye care, which has started in the Vedic age, and through generations it has come to the modern era. Cataract surgery and glasses were prescribed even from the very early stages, but the conditions were below par and usually there was no follow-up. Coming to the modern era, the 19th and 20th centuries, we had technological improvement, both indigenous and otherwise. The great stride occurred when RP Center for Ophthalmic Sciences was started in 1967 in All India Institute of Medical Sciences, built by Rajkumari Amrit Kaur. Now, I joined in Government Ophthalmic Hospital Trivandrum in the 1970s. And I had to work in the era when I had the opportunity to work in the era where there was no specialty. This was the small building of School of Optometry, and this is the OP and ward building. And we had few instruments for our help in the OP and ward for diagnosis and management of cases. But we could give good care, eye care to patients with these instruments. Cataract surgery evolved from ab-externo incision and intracapsular extraction, and then to phaco and SICS of the present age. In olden days, aphakic correction was given with glasses, and it was very cumbersome. I had my phaco training in Aravind. And after my retirement only, I had the phaco training. So in the modern era, we have the phacoemulsification surgery with intraocular lens implantation, which is a state-of-art surgery, and also small incision cataract surgery, which is also very good with intraocular lens implantation. Now, eye care advance in India. Various projects were introduced by WHO, and great achievement was done by programs put forward like a National Prevention and Control of Blindness and Vision 2020. School health programs were introduced, and eye camps, both screening and surgical, were done. Mobile eye units for screening and eye surgery, and eye banking was also available because of the introduction of these programs. So great achievement was seen with the introduction of these programs. In Vision 2020 aimed at elimination of avoidable blindness, including refractive errors. So this is the present situation of Ophthalmic Hospital, Trivandrum, Regional Eye Institute of Ophthalmology. You can compare the old and the new building. So a vast difference has occurred between the decades that has passed. Modern instruments have come into vogue to help the surgeon in the diagnosis and management. Eye camps are conducted. School health programs are there. So the eye care has advanced very much. I had the opportunity to work in mobile unit at Kottayam. We had both screening and surgical camps. Surgery was done in the campsite itself with a special room with all aseptic precautions. But now, with the advent of modern techniques, the surgery has shifted to hospital. Now, eye care past and present. Conventional eye care consisted of identification of disease, diagnosis and management, whereas in the present we give prevention besides treatment, promotion and rehabilitation with return of the individual to a comfortable way of living. Being a person who has evolved through the times of abextono-incision cataract surgery to phacoemulsification cataract surgery, I am a strong supporter of technology and advances in ophthalmology. But we should not be oblivious of the fact that comprehensive eye care is the false face seen by the public, and it is the base of eye care pyramid, without which we cannot effectively provide accessible eye care to the masses. So what are the changes that are needed? Even today, the present system concentrates only on conventional eye care with little emphasis on other aspects of eye. Now coming to comprehensive eye care. What is comprehensive eye care? It is defined as a strategy which aims to ensure that people have access to eye care services that meet their needs at every stage of life. This includes not only prevention and treatment services, but also visual rehabilitation. This is the pyramidal structure of comprehensive eye care. Eye examination, eye care, and health system integration is required for this. I would like to stress upon the importance of comprehensive eye care in the current day ophthalmic practice. The building blocks of the comprehensive eye care are these, which give good quality, high, safe healthcare to the public. CMEs are important and they should be attended by both ophthalmologists and trainees. Training is also important in comprehensive eye care to give good healthcare to the public. This is the eye infrastructure where we have the primary, secondary and tertiary centers where all these special surgeries can be done in the tertiary centers in addition to the primary and secondary centers where they do the basic eye examination and common eye surgeries. And in the center par excellence, we have the research and the laying standards and quality assessment. Primary eye care is an integral part of comprehensive eye care in the community health centers, and timely referral is important. CMEs and conferences should be attended both for practicing ophthalmologists and for postgraduate trainees. It helps to keep your knowledge at par with the advancing technology and also helps good rapport between the ophthalmologists. In teaching institution, it has a great role. They have the role to mold the younger generation. So training is important especially in the teaching institutions. Postgraduates require to be trained to handle all types of cases, eye cases that can be seen in the primary centers, so that when they go out, they will be able to be a part of CEC and give good care to the public. Teachers also need periodic training apart from attending CMEs and conferences. But there are barriers for implementation and these should be overcome. Now, what is the role of general ophthalmologists in comprehensive eye care? They provide primary services and support, which most cases need. They also do follow-up of non-communicable eye diseases like age-related macular degeneration and diabetic retinopathy, which requires good follow-up and support in all stages. Also, ROP screening can be done. Only personal trained personnel should be there. General ophthalmologists are there in many eye institutions, especially medical colleges, district hospitals, and even in the private sector. In the era when there was no subspecialization, they used to deal with all types of cases. But with subspecialization, this practice is declining. But even now it can be done to a certain extent and should be done. Only some training is required and the will and the skill to do it. I would like to stress upon the importance of comprehensive eye care in the current day ophthalmic practice. Teamwork is important, and we have got neurosurgery department, ENT department, and maxillofacial surgery and plastic surgery, which they can help us in managing many eye diseases, especially trauma. The general ophthalmologist should be able to perform surgery efficiently with excellent outcome. Who will provide eye care? Specialist or generalist? This is the era of specialization, but there are not enough specialists, which leads to difficulty in accessibility to the public. Good rapport between the specialist and generalist is essential. The general ophthalmologist can acquire the required training, or the specialist can work as a general ophthalmologist also. This will be useful to the community at large. To subspecialize depends a lot on the ophthalmologist's personality, desires, and skills. CMEs are very important. The training doctors should be given particular care so that they can attend to all types of cases that come to the primary centers or secondary centers. And if in case of reference, they can refer the cases in time. I had the opportunity to do some difficult cases during my period when there was no specialty, and in collaboration with the neurosurgery department, we did this excision of meningioma and we give a plastic repair. This is another case of nevus of aorta, where the patient had proptosis of the left eye with some artificial eye was given somewhere else, and the meningioma was excised, excision was done, and plastic repair was given, cosmetic repair was given to the left orbit. General ophthalmologists can do a lot of other surgeries also. Examples, strabismus surgery, mainly horizontal surgery can be done without much problem. Also orbital diseases like diffuse cystitis surgery can be done. Glaucoma surgery, trabeculectomy is very easy to be done in the by the general ophthalmologist. Injuries to the eye and corneal blindness can be tackled with keratoplasty, especially in cases of corneal ulcer. Therapeutic keratoplasty, timely intervention may be done because eye banking is available in many medical colleges and main district hospitals. Eye camps are very important for screening of diseases and detection, and they can be taken to the centers for giving good care. Teleophthalmology is gaining more importance now. It holds great potential to overcome barriers and improve quality and access. And it produces the desired clinical outcome also. Comprehensive eye camps can also be done, and recently it has gained more importance in the present scenario of pandemic COVID-19. Safe ophthalmology practices in COVID-19 scenario protocol is given by the Health and Family Welfare Department. Patient flow chart is there. This is a slit lamp with a breath shield that can be used. And take care of yourself, take care of others who care for us, and take care of others. What is the future of eye care in India? This depends upon these 4 factors: human resource development and skill-based training, appropriate eye care to all people in the locality, partnership and interaction between eye care providers, both public and private, use of technology for documentation and analysis, innovation and translational research. Policy change, as in National Prevention and Control of Blindness, by empowering the state administration for qualitative and quantitative improvement, has to be implemented throughout the country. How should we go forward? A new approach that will combine the best of old tradition and the new technology of analytics is required to imagine the future of eye care in India. Human workforce must match the infrastructure development, and the participation of like-minded non-governmental organizations is necessary for the ultimate benefit. This is the time to redefine eye care in India. New technologies are coming forward, and I am sure in the future, our ophthalmologists will be able to give good eye care, both in India and in our state. Last but not least, quality of life is important not only for patients, but also for doctors. Thank you for your patient hearing.
Thank you, Professor C.V. Radha Devi, for that wonderful insight that you have given us. We move on to our instruction course, the specialty eye care at peripheral centers for a general ophthalmologist during COVID lockdown and when to refer. For the first talk, it gives me great pleasure to invite Dr. Laila Mohan, who needs no introduction, who is a pan-ophthalmologist, and Madam will be dealing with managing injuries, ocular injuries at the peripheral eye center and when to refer. Over to you, Madam, for your talk.
Thank you, KSOS and Dr. Lakshmi, for giving me the opportunity to share some of the practical tips in injuries to the eye. I'm sharing my screen. Managing eye injuries, when to refer. So, eye is exposed to a lot of dangerous situations, more than other parts of the body, since we try to see what we do, like nailing a wall, blast from crackers, metal wire repair work. Onlookers can also be affected due to watching close to a workstation, or a welding arc injury can occur for an onlooker. So the nature of injury is very, very important. Mechanism and mode of injury should be obtained firsthand from the patient. Children hesitate in front of the parents thinking that they might scold them, but firsthand information should always be obtained firsthand if it is possible. A welding arc exposure, though unusually symptomatic, is relieved in 2 to 3 days with mild antibiotic, steroids, and lubricants. A history of flying object, blunt injury, large object, all these are important to decide what investigations to do. It gives you an idea of what to look for. A chance of perforation of the globe. CT scan should be done in case if there is a foreign body. Poking with pen, chance of deep injury is there. We see a lot more pediatric eye injuries with pen, palm leaf, knife, scissors, nowadays, especially during this online classes and COVID period. Tarsal foreign body with coordinate abrasion is very common in a patient, in a person traveling by bike at the window seat with a fast wind. Insect wings are very common. They do not get dislodged very easily. So evert upper lid and look for a foreign body. Often you will see a foreign body and a localized corneal abrasion seen on the cornea, which gives you a clue that the foreign body is there. So that has to be removed. Chemical injuries are not meant to be discussed here, but because the time factor is important and they come to a doctor and immediate treatment is important. So immediate irrigation is crucial if the globe is intact. Copious wash with normal saline or ringer lactate, 1 to 3 liters at least for 30 minutes. Speculum will help in patient keeping the eyes open, and a topical anesthetic can be used to give comfort to the patient when washing, and remove visible particles, especially when there is a lime injury. Unless a corrosive acid or alkali injury is there, other chemicals like disinfectants can be managed well with antibiotics, cycloplegic lubricants, and steroids used with caution. See the patient more frequently. When there is blanching of conjunctiva, which means there is ischemia, you have to refer the patient. Open globe injuries, nature of injury is important. A flying iron piece at lathe machine, nailing, shattered glass, all these are history suggesting an intraocular foreign body also. And insignificant sealed corneal wound may be seen. As you see here, the iris hole or the cataract may be the clue that there is a penetration. And of course, when there is an iris prolapse, you know that it's a penetrating injury and you have to refer. But the most important thing is keep an eye shield, rigid eye shield, before referring, and rule out any intraocular foreign body after wound closure can be done, and tell them the possibility of further interventions and investigations. So when the patient comes, vision should be checked if possible. Do no harm, no pressure on the eye with a rigid eye shield, which has to be given. Prophylaxis for tetanus if there is no delay, and prophylactic systemic antibiotics. In an adult, oral ciprofloxacin will do. And in a child, gentamicin, if it can be given, can be given. And any chance of endophthalmitis in a late presentation, more than 24 hours, is as high as 50%. So immediate referral is important, and ask the patient to keep nil oral if it is to be done under GA. And blunt injuries, hyphema is very common injury. Any amount of hyphema indicates severe form of trauma. Injuries with fist, ball, muttle are very common. Fundus should be seen, and pupil, visual acuity, and intraocular pressure. If the fundus is not available, of course, it is a dense hyphema. So re-bleed is possible during first 4 to 5 days. So complete bed rest is advisable with head and up about 30 to 40 degrees with cycloplegics and steroid drops. After resolution, you can do a gonioscopy to rule out any angle recession, and a B scan to rule out posterior segment pathology if there is no view of the fundus. And total hyphema, especially 8-ball dense dark hyphema, if not resolving, has to be closely watched for high intraocular pressure. And even after acetazolamide and maximum anti-glaucoma medications, if IOP is not coming down, it has to be evacuated and AC washed to prevent corneal blood staining, which is vision threatening. You can see this is corneal blood staining, which you may miss. So along with this, orbital hemorrhage can occur, and a CT scan will have to be done. Blow-up injury should be looked for. If there is a growing edema with RAPD or high IOP, lateral canthotomy and cantholysis has to be done with a local anesthetic here and a clamp with an artery forceps. You can just release the lateral canthus so that pressure on the globe is released. Blowout fracture, classic blowout is common in children. Classic blowout fracture presents with ecchymosis, proptosis, edema, especially in the adult. A fist injury, cricket ball injury, these are the history. In adult, it may be medico-legal also, so record vision as soon as possible, and CT scan is a must. Subcutaneous emphysema, tenderness over the bone, restricted vertical movements are seen. With it may be difficult at the first on the first day because of the edema. You should ask the patient not to blow out nose before sending for CT scan. And a course of antibiotics and anti-inflammatory medicines are started immediately. Reassess the movements after edema subsides, which will show enophthalmos and if there is marked entrapment. What should not be missed is a white-eyed blowout fracture. The child, it is usually seen in a child and present as a syncopal attack. Easily missed diagnosis in a child when ecchymosis is completely absent. This child was brought from the neurology department with pain on eye movements, and he was an inpatient, so he was wheeled to our hospital. There were abrasions on the right side of the face. Actually, this is on the right side of the face. I think this is a selfie. Abrasions are seen on the face and elevation depression restricted. There is no ecchymosis, no edema. There is enophthalmos, as you can see here. And classic blowout fracture was seen on CT scan. And this needs emergency management to release the muscle from fracture line to prevent necrosis of muscle and relieve symptoms of bradycardia. So this is an emergency. Lid injuries, simple lid tear can be managed easily. Wound toilet has to be done to remove foreign body, and approximation with a 6-0 vehicle can be done with silk or vehicle. If there is skin loss, you may have to take deeper bites and undermine the skin so that there is no stretching of the skin. Orbital fat prolapse indicates that there is deep injury and foreign body should be looked for, and there should be no deep sutures. Canalicular injuries are very common in children. More than 50% occur due to avulsion, that is an injury away from the lid from the canaliculus. And the blouse hook injury is common during breastfeeding in children. You can see this is a well-apposed wound, and you may think that it is just the lid skin, but The canaliculus is often injured, and often you see this under GA when you when you try to do the lid repair. A mini monoca, that is monocanalicular intubation of the traumatized canaliculus, gives good alignment as well as patency of the canaliculus. And a globe evaluation should be done also. And syringing the normal canaliculus with trip and blue may help locate the distal end of the injured canaliculus. And a mini monoca gives good alignment. Even when this is a trauma with the lacrimal sac injury as well. And this is an upper lid injury where the mini monoca helps in alignment of the injured structures also. This can be removed after 3 months. Late presentations. Primary repair is the best repair. If improper approximation, there may be notching of the lid margin, ectropion, lid lag, all can produce exposure, and it's a big cosmetic blemish too. A lateral canthotomy may have to be done if there is shortening of the lid also. And probing of the upper punctum or bicanalicular intubation helps in these cases. Full thickness, coming to full thickness injuries, lid margin injuries are very important. Definitely, the first primary repair is the best. So otherwise there will be a notching like this. You can see a notching after the repair. So lid margin is approximated absolutely with point-to-point alignment by a vertical mattress suture. And the tarsal plate is first sutured with interrupted 6-0 vicryl from below upward after a temporary suture is placed in the meibomian orifices. Vertical mattress sutures, 3 suture technique of the lid margin repair at the meibomian orifice, anterior lash line and gray line. And sutures are left long to be included in this is the suture, and it is left long and it can be included in the skin suture, which can be removed later. And the margin sutures are left for 2 weeks. Avulsion of tarsus can occur in direct or avulsion in children. Evaluate the extent of injury and globe and tarsus. And if the globe is injured, it has to be repaired first. And orbital involvement should be looked for. Meticulous suturing has to be done from deep to superficial. And sutures in the tarsus should be partial thickness, not rubbing on the cornea. And levator should be sutured to the upper third of the tarsus. And a posterior segment should be evaluated once the edema subsides. So the take-home message is immediate management by irrigation is required in chemical injury. All open globe injuries should be sent with an eye shield to protect the eye, and chance of foreign body should be highlighted. Lid margin suturing should be meticulously done. A primary repair is the best. In extensive lid injuries, associated globe injury should be looked for and tackled first. Posterior segment should be looked for later. Blunt injuries with angle recession should have an annual checkup of IOP. Any blunt injury, it is best to advise annual checkup of the eye to follow up intraocular pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Laila Madam, for that wonderful talk. Next, I would like to invite Dr. Irshad Edavana, Assistant Professor of Ophthalmology in Malabar Medical College, Calicut, to give us an idea on dealing with corneal perforations in the peripheral center, tips and tricks. Over to you, Dr. Irshad.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshmi, for the introduction. I would like to thank KSY's Scientific Committee and Dr. Lakshmi for giving me the opportunity. Today, I am going to present tips and tricks in the Blue PCL application. So, application of this Blue PCL should be known by all ophthalmologists because it's an outpatient procedure, can be done in all ophthalmology setups, and this is a very emergency procedure that can save the globe. So, Blue PCL will minimize the risk of secondary complications, including endophthalmitis, choroidal hemorrhage, glaucoma, and subluxation of lens. It's very important to identify early desmatocyl formation and a microperforation. So, in a thinning, if there is a central clear zone, you should suspect a desmatocyl. And in perforation, there will be a growth hypotony, a positive serial stress, or flat or shallow anterior chamber. So, in all deep pulses, chronic ocular surface condition, you have to suspect or check for a corneal perforation. We know the mechanism of METI. It is basically because of the tissue lysis. So it is by the bacteria or the WBC or natural by the proteases. And whenever there's a desmotic formation, by a trauma or straining can cause perforation. We have tissue adhesives in our hands. One is biological and non-biologic. Biological is fibrin glue, but it has very less tissue strength, tensile strength. So it's not appropriate appropriate for a sealing effect in a frank perforation. So that's why I use the cyanoacrylate. The ideal case of a glue BCL, the perforation ideally should be less than 2 millimeter, or we can try 2 to 3 millimeters also. A concave profile. So because it's concave profile, they will sit the glue nicely. And third one, a location of the ulcer away from the limbus. Whenever there is an ulcer in the limbus, the glue touches with the conjunctiva and there will be a less adhesion. We know cyanoacrylic acid esters are the cyanoacrylates. We have acetocryl, nexacryl, dermabond, etc. The most common cyanoacrylate glue we have in our household is super glue. That is methyl 2 cyanoacrylate. It has a very short side chain, so it has more process and more it is not medicated. So that's why using endocryl in our clinic we use, because endocryl is easily available. It's a 0.5 ml a bottle. It costs about 350 to 400 rupees and it's freely available across India. It is N-butyl cyanoacrylate. Whenever there is a long side chains of the cyanoacrylate, there will be less tissue toxicity. We need a dry condition for the polymerization of the glue. And second one, peak bonding strength of occurs at about 2 millimeter. Cyanoacrylate are bacteriostatic. It acts against the gram-positive organisms because of the absence of the lipopolysaccharide. It has a bacteriostatic activity which increases with the decreased side chains. Also prevent the tissue melting by inhibition of the production of collagenases. So in tissue melting, it helps to prevent the melting. Also, it's a bacteriostatic. So we are going for the tips for the technique of applications. So glue can be applied either slit lamp or the operation theater. Preferably, I prefer to do in operation theater because we can maintain the aseptic precaution. Second one, we can form the anterior chamber with the air or visco in the procedure easily in a slit lamp in a operation theater. If it is not possible, you can do the slit lamp also. Okay, use topical anesthesia. Local anesthesia is necessary. The issue is that when you give a local anesthesia or a block, chance of increased orbital volume and leaking of ocular content is there. So you should be very cautious and you should avoid massage with the eye. And during the eye speculum, you're using of eye speculum, to be very careful that speculum is not compressing the globe, and you should get the adequate exposure. If the anterior chamber is flat, you can form the anterior chamber with either with air bubble or with viscoelastic material. That can be done using a side port. Just make a side port. It's a flat anterior chamber, so make a side port little more vertically and then form the anterior chamber with the air. Always make sure that this needle is in the anterior chamber and prevent dust mite detachment. The two important things you should remember before applying glue. One, we have to degrade the necrotic epithelium 2 to 3 millimeter around the perforation, because once when there is an epithelium, glue will not attach to the epithelium, so that leads to loosening of the glue. Second one is keep surface dry throughout the procedure. Whenever there is an active leak, glue will not stay there. We are going to the procedure. I'll show you one video. So we are drying the epithelium. Drying the surface well. Make sure there is no active leak by using a sponge. Dry it well. So after that, always better to aspirate the glue in a 2cc syringe, or you can use 1 ml syringe also, and insert the 30 gauge needle or 26 gauge needle, and put that glue on a metallic surface or a drape. So the glue will be like a uh, drop, small drop. From there, take the other side of the Merosil sponge and dip that sponge, plastic side of the sponge on the drop, and then take minimal amount of the glue and apply minimal amount of glue to the cornea. You can directly apply this glue with a 26 gauge needle, but the issue is that most of the time there will be more amount of the glue that is applied, and that can cause early dislodgement of the VCM. So here glue is attached little. So we are cutting the glue and then put the VCL, but there's an excess glue there. So removing that glue, or just cut that, because whenever there's a sharp surface that can cause a tearing of the BCL, and later foreign body sensation, papillary conjunctivitis. So it's always make sure there is minimal amount of glue, and put BCL only after drying of the glue. Post-operatively, pyramid is applied, and first day check for digital IOP and whether the anti-chamber is formed or not, and any dislodgement of the glue or BCL. Continue antibiotics, antifungal medications. Better to avoid ointments. If it is using, we are using antifungals, better to convert to voriconazole, because antimicrobial have more precipitates. If it is necessary to continue antimicrobial, we can continue. Then add lubricants also, and close follow-up. And glue usually stay for 2 to 3 months. Once epithelialization occurs, glue falls by itself. You don't have to remove the glue forcefully, because most of the time if you remove glue forcefully, that can lead to a reperforation. You can change the BCL after 1 or 1.5 months if it is not attached to the glue, and explain the patient that there's a chance of foreign body sensation once the BCL is loose or detached. So ask the patient to come back to us whenever there is a foreign body sensation. So most common adverse effect one is the trauma and neovascular sensation. It is an anticipated feature of the healing and the toxicity of the glue. And other one is the giant papillary conjunctivitis, secondary glaucoma, synechiae formation, and secondary bacterial infiltration that can happen. Uh, so you should be vigilant about that complication. And perforation, if it's about 3 to 4 millimeter size, we can use modified method of glue BCL, like cut a small disc of plastic drape that we use for our routine surgery. Can take 4 millimeter size of the plastic drape. I put a drop of glue over the drape, and just put the drape over the eye and put one more drop of glue, so that drape will cover the area of the cornea and give more sealant effect. Thank you for listening. You can discuss the questions at the end of the session.
Thank you, Dr. Irshad, for that wonderful talk. The next topic in the session is how to care for your pediatric patients during lockdown, to refer or not.
I would like to call Dr. Lakshmi for her presentation. That's how to carry a pediatric patients during lockdown, refer or not.
Good afternoon, one and all. So today the pattern is to refer subspecialty patients to their respective specialists who are concentrated in towns and cities. So the problem during lockdown and restraints in travel is that the patients find it difficult to reach there and get the appropriate treatment. So we are faced with the onus of providing at least basic specialty care in the primary eye care level. So we'll just share a few ideas on how to manage pediatric patients in such a situation. So this is just a disclaimer. It's not for the experienced pan-ophthalmologists. It says for people who are just starting their practice and how to modify their practice. So the problems faced during the COVID-19 scenario is, as we discussed, are such and such. And what can you do as a general ophthalmologist? And do we need any special instruments or costly gadgets? Actually, you don't need many. You just need the basic armamentarium, which we use for any small practice. And plus a skill in indirect ophthalmoscopy and streak retinoscopy will do the trick. And the vision charts, pediatric vision charts, usually they come with the LED charts, which are available nowadays. So that need not be invested separately. An occluder is needed in pediatric practice. And what cases you should never miss and which needs an urgent referral are, as we all know, retinoblastoma, retinal detachment, cases in which we suspect retinopathy of prematurity, pediatric cataracts. All these things need urgent referral, and we need to advise the parents regarding the same and regarding the necessity for urgency in treatment. Cases which we can manage for the time being are amblyopia with or without squint, refractive accommodative esotropias, post-operative follow-up of pediatric cataract patients who are stable and without any other complications, ptosis which does not compromise vision, stable squints on follow-up, and congenital nasolacrimal duct obstruction. This is not an exhaustive list. These are some of the cases. So how do you go about in examining a pediatric or pediatric age patient? So the first and foremost would be the red reflex test, especially you do it in babies, which gives us a lot of information regarding media opacities and things like that. External inspection should be done to rule out any structural or congenital anomaly. Pupillary evaluation, fixation and following. Corneal light reflex will give a lot of information regarding squint. And the cover tests, I would advise you to be adept with cover test and its interpretations. Visual acuity should be evaluated in whichever cases possible. The Bruckner test should be done in a dimly lighted room. You can do it with your streak retinoscope or with your direct ophthalmoscope. The red reflex in both the eyes are viewed at the same time, and an asymmetry is noted, which gives an idea about the lens opacities, cataracts or media opacities or retinal problems, or even gross anisometropias and squints. Ptosis, which does not cover the visual axis and which does not pose an immediate threat to vision, like Marcus gun jaw winking phenomenon, can be safely observed, but you have to do the retinoscopy and fundus evaluation before observing the child. Congenital nasolacrimal duct obstruction can be observed till 10 to 12 months of age, and the technique of massage should be stressed upon to the parent. And most of the parents come with wrong technique in massage. We should refer in cases of acute acral cystitis or cellulitis, and probing should be done at 1 year if it doesn't resolve, and the parents should be aware of this fact. So this is the correct technique of Krigler massage with steady pressure on the inner canthus followed by downward pressure towards the nose. Refractive correction, most of you would be already doing it, but we can follow certain guidelines like the American Academy guidelines and the All India Institute consensus in prescribing glasses to children. This definitely should be associated with individualization and pearls of experience. So these are two scenarios. First one is a 3-year-old child with a gross anisometropia, and the second one is an astigmatism with almost equal amount of astigmatism in both the eyes. So the first case, we expect amblyopia and we need to give importance to occlusion therapy, maybe a little bit earlier than the usual. And in the second scenario, maybe we can wait for a few weeks before starting any occlusion therapy if needed. Squints with refractive errors, we need to give the optical correction first. In this case, we can see that there is a little bit of anisometropia between the two eyes, and glasses would be the first treatment. and followed by correction, surgical correction, which can be done later on, and occlusion therapy might be required. And correction may not be required in some cases, which gets controlled with glasses and occlusion therapy alone. So when to start patching or occlusion? Usually we give a 6 to 8 week interval for the optical correction effect to happen. The optical correction effect is variable in many children, and it might take from 16 to 18 months. So 2 hours of patching in a moderate amblyopia and 6 hours in severe amblyopia would be adequate, and both should be associated with 1 hour of near activity. Make yourself familiar with the cover tests. In this patient, we can see that initially with the cover test, we do not see much of squinting, and we just find whether the child is taking up fixation with the squinting eye. And on prolonged cover, we can see that the squint appears, and we can assess the squint by doing a cover test. Fixation pattern should be carefully observed. We should check whether the fixation is central, steady, and maintained. Initially, we can just distract the child or get their attention with a toy or something like that, and followed by uniocular occlusion and checking for fixation. So you can do it with a toy, or you can do it with a torchlight, whichever the child is interested in. You can use that to check central, steady, maintained fixation. This is another child with a fixation test revealing a vision problem in the left eye. Initially, we do not find much of problem, but as we go through the examination, we find that the left eye has involuntary upward movement and it's not fixing when the child uses both the eyes. This child had a retinal problem in the left eye, which precluded fixation in the left eye. Always patch and check for ductions when in doubt, because children, it might be a little bit confusing. Patching will help you. Keep an extra weapon in your armamentarium, because toys are very useful. Sometimes you may not be able to get the attention of the child without any of these gadgets. Don't miss a refractive error or a fundus pathology. I would like to stress the importance of retinoscopy and indirect ophthalmoscopy in examining a child. For the pediatric postoperative patient, that is cataract postoperative patient, we have to assess vision, fixation pattern, clarity of the visual axis, presence of intraocular pressure rise or glaucoma, posterior segment evaluation, and a correct refractive correction, including the near vision aid with a continuance on the amblyopia therapy. Another tip would be keep up with the recent developments and recent accessible gadgets, because you don't need a fundus camera or a slit lamp camera these days. You can use the mobile phone, the smartphone with adequate gadgets. We have ample amount of instruction courses on the same. And if you are adept with all these things, you can share information with your colleagues and specialty friends and get guidance for treatment. Use social media and communication to your advantage. This helps you a lot in treating patients, especially during such circumstances. And this is the case scenario which prompted me in thinking about this instruction course. This was a 1-year-old child post retinoblastoma enucleation in the left eye, who presented with a recurrence of 4 days, 4 days duration, a swelling of 4 days duration, which was a recurrence. And this child came during the lockdown period, and the child was unable to travel to the eye hospital for further treatment. And naturally, we send the patient back to the place where they got treatment. But in this patient, the problem is the child does not need a treatment in the eye. Actually, the child needs treatment from the oncology center. So this patient, we got the information from the eye hospital where he was treated. They were very kind enough to share the information, and the information was passed on to the oncology center, and the child could get correct treatment without any delay. So with a little bit of effort from our side and guidance, we can do a lot for these patients, even in such demanding circumstances. So thank you for your patient listening, and thank you all my teachers for making me able to present such an instruction course in KSOS. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lakshmi.
Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Ghana Ajoy, consultant retina surgeon in Comtrust Eye Hospital, Calicut, for giving us tips regarding the successful management of retinal diseases and retinal cases during the context of limited modes of transport. Over to you, Dr. Ghana.
Good afternoon, everyone. At the outset, I would like to thank Dr. Lakshmi for giving me this wonderful opportunity to be a part of Virtual Drishti 2020. Let me jump right into the presentation. So my topic is retina management from remote location, and this came into play in our day-to-day practice during the period of complete lockdown, and it continues to this day. Every day we modify our approach. The challenge is patient is at risk for permanent vision loss. Communication is key, as always. We have to inform and reassure the patient, and we have to provide them a COVID-free environment with more space, lesser talk, lesser crowding, and greater ventilation. When this lockdown came down on us, we were caught unawares, and it kept us scrambling for some way to settle into this new norm. How do we manage patient without seeing them at all? Is there any equipment? If not, can we diagnose and symptoms alone? If diagnosed, how far can we delay management? These were all questions we kept asking ourselves. So based on this, we divided our retina management into patients, what symptoms are they presenting? Do we have any past reviews of the patient? Are they new patients, completely newless? Or do we have any local support? So when it came to the symptoms, so patient if they presented with say sudden or rapid loss of vision, acute onset flashes or floaters, painful loss of vision, or a recent onset metamorphopsia or reading difficulty, they were asked to come to us. We couldn't wait, especially if we have no way of knowing how they are doing, so we were asked them to do it early. Now, I thought we'd discuss this with some case reports. So this is a 56-year-old lady who came to us with defective retina of 2 weeks duration, and we can see that this patient has macular branch vein occlusion with macular edema. So we had seen her in March and we had advised antivision. But lockdown set in. Now should she come back or should she wait? These were the questions. So in case of PRP with macular edema, we can afford to wait without doing any additional harm to the patient. We can wait for a period beyond 4 weeks, even up to 8 weeks, and then start the antivision injection. What about this patient? He was a 70-year-old male seen by an ophthalmologist with new onset central retinal vein occlusion and macular edema. So should he come to us? Should we see him immediately? These were the questions. So with CRView, we have to look for RAPD. Does the patient have new vascularization? Or does the other eye like? So in such situation, if it's a new onset CRView with macular edema, better to inject it. Whereas if it's a stable CRView with macular edema, having had multiple interventional injections, they can afford to inject after 4 weeks. So CRView with a vision acuity that is greater or equal to 6.9, you can wait. You can wait even up to 4 weeks. Now this 38-year-old lady came to us with defective vision of 1 week in the right eye, and you can see an area of subfoveal detachment, serous retinal detachment, suggestive of CSCR. And usually we'd advise monthly follow-up. But in this scenario, perhaps it is better to avoid. So what can we do? We can watch for scotoma, metamorphopsia, is it better? Are the symptoms getting better? Is she using any steroids? Please stop. And you can ask them at 1 month if she is indeed doing better. She may not come. In fact, most cases resolve on its own anyway. And UK guidelines actually even advise a 6-month review in cases CSCR. This particular patient is chronic CSCR. We can even advise up to a yearly review if there are no fresh symptoms. This 54-year-old lady, she was on hydroxychloroquine. She came to us for toxicity screening in December 2019. We can see the right eye has a very foveal hypopigmentation, and this eye has some areas of hypo and hyperpigmentation. Is she an XCQ toxicity? Does she have retinal toxicity? But you can see that right eye fundus autofluorescence appears to be normal. Left eye has vague areas, not suggestive of toxicity. So there is no toxicity. You can wait up to 3 months, even up to 6 months to screen them again. In cases of cone dystrophies, like this 20-year-old with photopsia, she has bullseye maculopathy in both eyes, as demonstrated by the fundus autofluorescence. No need for strict follow-up. Even in cases of Stargardt's or even PFT, parafoveal telangiectasia, like this fundus picture here. In such cases, unless there's a sudden drop in vision, we can afford to wait. What about diabetic retinopathy? If it's mild NPR or moderate NPR, you can prolong follow-up up to 6 months or beyond. If it's in this case, this is a case with severe NPDR in both eyes clinically, but when doing fundus fluorescence angiography, you can see a new vessel in the temporal area. Actually, this is one case that needs later, but can delay the laser and can delay the follow-up, give good metabolic control, and wait up to 4 weeks and then do the laser if needed. In the case of post-PRP stable PDR, they're already on prolonged follow-up. They can be given even beyond a yearly review in this case. Now, diabetic macular edema, if the vision is greater than 612, it is a stable DME, you can maintain on observation along with good metabolic control. And if IVI, intraocular injections, are needed, you can wait beyond 4 weeks. Whereas if it is a diabetic macular edema with drop less than 612, patient is monoocular, or patient is a patient with severe NPDR, never LASIK macular edema, and a recent drop in visual acuity, better to inject in less than 3 weeks. Dry AMD has a slow follow. This 83-year-old gentleman, he came with drop emission in the left eye. You can see that there is subretinal hemorrhage, there is a hemorrhagic PD. So this is an IPCV, and we advised anti-VEGF. We took 3 doses, and then his PD, hemorrhagic PD, the size seems to have come down. There is no subretinal, no signs of activity. It is remaining stable. The patient can even be given a home AMSLA. That is one way to follow up these patients. Of course, there are other routes and some methods of telescreening. I'll come to it a little later. Now, so these were all the patients, all the scenarios that were recommended for delayed management as laid down by VRSA and AOS. They are patients receiving regular injections, but they are stable. Routine follow-up for wet AMD, DME, and RVO. Patient who is stable and has not needed injection in the last visit. Regular patients with NPDR and PDR who are stable post-surgery, stable post-RV surgery. These are all patients who are ideal for even telephonic consultation. Now, so far I've been talking about review patients who are known to us. What about people who are new to us? So one way was local support. They saw the local ophthalmologist who then communicated to us. Is there some way to aid them? During this unusual times, we need more options. So one was cost-effective fundus cameras, which are easily affordable. One such one is this Fundus on phone or Remedio Fundus on iPhone. This is a smartphone-based infrared-enabled device. This is non-mydriatic and portable. And we are actually using them for diabetic retinopathy screening. Even in young children or infants, we can try because this is portable device and we can place it as we're doing for this 22-year-old baby. And this is an image that is obtained by this particular device, and you can see there's a retinochoroblastoma in this side, there is foveal hypoplasia. The cons is it has only a 45-degree field and the periphery cannot be visualized. Diabetic retinopathy screening needs to be done by trained personnel. The WHO actually advises that every year, every diabetic needs an annual fundoscopy. So if you think about it, 500 million people generate about 1 billion images that need to be read by trained personnel. So we need help. So this is a huge disease person for trained personnel alone. So there are certain smartphone, of course, based imaging devices with AI. So this is an algorithm for such a automated screening process, and it works for VR. Now I thought, okay, fundus camera, smartphone based and all that seems a little expensive. So can I do it on my own? I tried, it did not work. So then I thought, okay, I've got a 20 diopter lens, I've got a smartphone. Is there something I can do with that? So this is me holding 20 diopter lens in my left hand and using a smartphone in the other hand. And this is the image I got by just using the video mode of the camera of the smartphone and using the torch to shine light into the retina. And I've got this myopic fundus with peripapillary atrophy. You can see the macular area showing myopic macular changes actually. Pretty good image for this particular device, or not, the smartphone that we have. So I thought I'll just run through this unedited video. Unedited because I just wanted you to see what I'm doing. I'm just holding this, and you can see that the macula is coming into view now. And as you keep looking, the disc comes into view. So you can actually even visualize the periphery of the eye very well actually. You can document the images, save them, forward them to whoever needs to read them. So it's a pretty good device. Now, ROP screening is an area where you need telescreening. So a fellow is actually doing the same method to screen this eye, and he sent us this image. This is showing plus disease, which is key for treatment actually. It is not perfect, but in these times it gives us some aid. Of course, there are more apps to help us these days. I'm sure there are many speakers who've spoken about this already. It's just a very simple way to move forward in this time. Now, smartphone-based fundus imaging has been introduced for screening purpose along with AI in ROP. Now, India has the highest number of premature births, greater than 3.5 million premature infants each year. Karnataka is doing the KID ROP program for ROP screening. Coimbatore is doing the ROP SOS program for ROP screening. Now, AMD, as I said, the problem with AMD is you need to do frequent appointments. That it's a recurring review, it's time consuming, and many need interventional injections at visits as well. So one thing that can avoid the patient coming directly to us is to a home cancer test. Unfortunately, it has only a 9% to 41% accuracy, and this is really unacceptable at this particular time. So if we have a visual acuity and if we have an OCT, telemedicine could be as useful as face-to-face office consultation. And now there are devices like this, the 4C Home TM. This is a standalone device, it's FDA approved, and in this, patients have demonstrated around 94% effectiveness in prevention or in detection of patients who are progressing to wet AMD. So they can detect this early, come to us, inject, go back, instead of coming each and every time. But with the same study, using Amsler, it's only around 62% of patients who have been detected. Now, Total Home OCT uses AI and a machine learning algorithm. This is a home OCT. They can sit at home, use this machine, see if there's any fluid, and only then come to the doctor for consultation. It's a very nice device that's coming up. Now, so far I've been with all the patients that you can afford to wait from coming to see us. But there are certain emergencies like conditions needing urgent surgeries, open lobe, RRD, fractional RD, or combined RD, endophthalmitis, or recent onset submacular hemorrhage, or a nucleus drop, or even treated cortical matter secondary trauma. They are all emergencies. Now, others include retinoblastoma, ocular tumors, neovascular AMD, CME, PCV, all of these which are fresh cases who need intravitreal injection, especially if they're one night. Even with DME or other forms, if they're one night, they have to come back. ROP screening, without a doubt, has to come back immediately to us for screening for lasers for anti-VEGF. Lasers are a priority in cases of active PDR, especially this HRPDR. ROP laser, of course, retinal taser breaks, laser barrage whenever required, extrafoveal CME. So to conclude, managing remotely helps us greatly. It allows us to stagger appointments, reducing crowding in our space. Unusual times call for the most effective measures. Not only cost, but time and space are also important priorities. So we have to make creative changes in telehealth, by telephone-based consultations, home-based care, and home monitoring devices. Thank you. And I would like to thank my chief instructor, Dr. Lakshmi, once again for giving me this wonderful opportunity, and to all my viewers for your very patient hearing.
Thank you, Dr. Gana, for that wonderful presentation. I would like to call upon Dr. Vinod Kumar Nalapat for giving us a little bit of information regarding the recent technologies, strategically using social media and platforms to your advantage for specialty eye care. Over to you, Dr. Vinod.
Good afternoon. First of all, let me thank the chief instructor of this session, Dr. Lakshmi, for giving me an opportunity to be a part of this virtual Drishti 2020. My topic for today is strategically using social media and platforms to your advantage for specialty eye care. Social media has come to the forefront of all activities in this pandemic. Imagine if we were in 1957, the influenza pandemic, and we had to do a Drishti in 1957. We would have recorded it in kilometers long film reels and would have been waiting for the theaters to open up to be seen by the public and ourselves. The virtual Drishti in 2020 is possible due to the social media. Social media, in essence, is a boon that has given us all sorts of information ranging from totally baseless ones to very useful ones. So I'm here to give you a little insight on how best we can use social media strategically to our advantage. Financial disclosure, none. So what is social media? As stated in the slide, social media is a computer-based technology that facilitates the building of virtual networks and communities. We can use it as a platform for sharing of ideas, thoughts, and information. It is basically an internet-based communications and which is accessible through mobile phones, computers, tablets, and televisions, thus giving us the smart era where anything and everything is smart. Social media is a very powerful tool and is a constant companion for most of us. Take, for example, Alexa. It's an artificial intelligence program which responds to us like a human companion. Social media and technology are ingrained into our daily routine. It is a useful platform where opinions and information can be shared worldwide instantly compared to traditional media. And it is also said to become the largest advertising media. COVID-19 has brought out the potential of social media. It has proved its worth during this pandemic. Its global reach and the rate of travel of information should be utilized continuously in the future. We will be left far behind if we don't incorporate it into our routine practice. During the initial days of the pandemic, it was an ophthalmologist, Dr. Li Wenliang in China, who attempted to inform his colleague through WeChat and Weibo, two social media platforms. It was one small text by him that made a huge impact, and he ultimately, unfortunately, succumbed to the same disease in February 2020. The next few slides show some statistics on the social media usage in India. 2 out of 3 Indians have smartphones and are on some kind of social media, and 97% of internet users access internet on their mobile phones. So most of the time, the social media is in your pocket. And the difference in Indian and urban are very minimal, and almost 70% of the males in urban as well as rural India uses social media, and 30% of females. And the maximum users between the age group 20 and 30. These are some of the social media platforms in India. Social media can be utilized in many ways. Blogs can give information on various topics of importance in healthcare. Microblogs are frequent short messages about any health-related topic, and this can be used to spread information. Wikis are online resources that can be edited by multiple users, and these are also used to share information which can be updated from time to time. YouTube videos are also used to share information. Virtual reality and gaming environments can be used to virtually create realistic simulation of many aspects of healthcare to educate professionals as well as the public. Now, if we combine all the resources that social media provides in the form of audio, video, and write-ups with the backing of professionals, especially healthcare professionals, it would be like a treasure trove for medical information. As an organization, Kerala Society of Ophthalmic Surgeons has conducted various webinars which are recorded and is available for public viewing through YouTube by anyone residing anywhere in the world with an internet connection. Likewise, we could cover many areas in eye healthcare such as glaucoma and diabetic retinopathy. Very recently, KSOS had a campaign on non-communicable diseases, and blogs and YouTube videos were used to spread awareness of NCDs. These are some of the programs KSOS had conducted during the pandemic lockdowns. According to a study in the US, the most widely used social media by physicians is Twitter. Daily usage of Twitter has been steadily increasing since the early days of this pandemic, and using Twitter, we can spread facts and credible information to a global audience. It could even be used as an updater for all members of this organization as well. Plus point is that certain tweets are archived by the Library of Congress. So Scientific Committee Chairman can please note that KSOS can even be featured in the archives in the Library of Congress using a Twitter account. Sharing of ideas regarding changes in clinical practice to help decrease the spread of COVID-19 was possible due to social media. AIOS, KSOS, and other state ophthalmic associations, individual practitioners, and hospitals have used this media to the maximum to formulate preferred practice patterns and share it among their members. If a normal seminar can be viewed by 100 people, the webinars held by ophthalmic associations have been viewed by thousands around the globe, with viewership increasing day by day. This will not be possible in a normal seminar. Designs of protective shields for slit lamps and imaging equipments were shared online and circulated widely on social media. Weeks before large outbreaks in the US, a report from Asia published in mid-February suggested the possibility of transmissibility of the virus through tears, thus triggering the discussion regarding the importance of protective eyewear. Our own members exhibited various do-it-yourself materials like face shields, UV disinfection cabinets, slit lamp barriers, to name a few, which was well appreciated the world over. You need to realize the fact that one individual sitting in any remote corner of the world can access information from miles away within seconds. Online platforms have been created by which we can interact with the patient, make video calls and monitor the patient, and encourage lifestyle modifications and also inquire about their drug compliance. Enhanced communication can be achieved with patient groups by blogs, microblogs, Facebook posts, etc. Communicating with the patient directly and clearing their doubts by the treating doctor through video calls improves patient satisfaction. Online consultation, which was introduced due to lockdowns, can be used post-COVID times for bedridden patients and patients who are out of station and for patients who need just a few comforting words now and then. Patient education videos, blogs, tweets, and posters can be shared via social media, and this can reach large group of patients. We see a lot of misinformation on social media, and we can counter them by posts explaining the scientific basis. We can direct patients to disease-specific groups on social media where the patient can interact with others having similar problems and share their experiences. Good always has a flip side. Likewise, social media is so vast that there is an overabundance of information, and this information has no control. So one has to make sure that the information we get is from a trusted source. When we do a search in Google, we get a lot of sites. One has to make sure about the authenticity of the sites before accepting the contents. So we should guide the patients to such sites through our social media interactions. We are more interested in evidence-based medicine, whereas social media gives more of individual patient stories, which can be highly misleading. Social media can be used to tarnish the image of professionals and institutions, and we see such incidents almost on a daily basis. It is important that we don't share patient information on social media, as this may violate medical ethics and can have legal implications. What can we do as a professional organization? KSOS has primarily concentrated on offline programs. It is high time we create a committee dedicated to the dissemination of information via social media to the public, our peers, and upcoming medical students, respectively, in a manner such that they receive credible, authentic, and personalized information that cannot be misinterpreted. We can use Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and countless other social media sites as a free online learning platform. We can filter our audience using privatized accounts, thereby creating a structured curriculum for e-learning. For example, surgical steps can be shared privately using short videos on Instagram, creating a permanent database for student access. Even extremely rare cases can be archived in such a way. Sharing information to the public must of course be monitored. A more simplified educational platform can be created for the general public to help them empathize with us, as well as understand decisions taken by doctors easily using credible information. This will help avoid unnecessary litigations and help in forming a strong patient-doctor relationship. For the past few minutes, I've been boring you with talks about social media. It is true that man has the ability to be a catalyst for change. But what needs to be understood is that in our hands, we hold the greatest tool that can help educate the world with just a few clicks and little loss of data. If used well, if we work to declutter the mass of information and streamline data pertaining to a career with due credits, it is a tool of great power. And of course, with it comes a great responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for sharing the tips and tricks. So now we come to a conclusion of our instruction course, and the session is open for discussion.